Welcome into another episode of the Fat Guy Podcast. I am the Fat Guy. Most people just call me Brett. Today we're going to be talking about the hows and whys of me fasting. And I do a combination of intermittent fasting and extended fasting. We're going to also break down the differences, benefits, and things there as well. This is going to be a master course. Well, that's not going to be a master course on fasting. It will be pretty in-depth on why I fast, and you probably will be surprised to learn some things today. Quick note. I have to thank my patrons who support me over on Patreon. You guys help pay the bills for this podcast hosting, which isn't super cheap. Been paying for it for several years, and I appreciate you guys chunking me a few bucks. Cindy Carr, Bessie Williams, Kenneth Wilkerson, and Bobby Houston. So if you're asking, man, why would I want to be a Patreon supporter by going to losewithmason.com and supporting what you're doing at the Fat Guy Podcast? Well, one, you get the podcast earlier, several days earlier. We're getting this routine down pat. We're working it out. It's been a challenge figuring out a good schedule, but I think I'm on track now. You get the podcast a couple of days earlier than everybody else gets it, and you get it without any of the commercials. So if you're annoyed at the ad that is at the beginning of the podcast, and you're annoyed that there's an ad about 10 minutes into the podcast, and you're like, why does he ruin this free podcast with ads? And you don't understand that I'm just trying desperately to offset the cost of the cost of hosting the podcast. Look, you can become a patron, and not only will you get the podcast several days before everybody else, you'll get it completely ad-free, and I'll chop out all this stuff. Like, all this garbage goes away too, so you don't have to listen to see that. That alone is worth saying, hey, here's a few bucks. Let me help you with what you're doing, because I appreciate the effort and time and the research and all the things you do to help people. So you can do that. Losewithmason.com is where you go. Losewithmason.com. And there's other benefits. You go to the top of the line if you want to ask me questions for help. You get a patron-only podcast that only patrons get to hear. I post research and detail and stuff over there that you don't get to see anywhere else. There's a lot of benefits. So head on over to losewithmason.com if you want to check that out. Follow us on social media. Lose with Mason is my username on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I gotta tell you, a lot of people follow me on my personal page, on my Brett Mason, just I'm a regular old guy profile. And I'm going to start posting less and less weight loss stuff there because, well, it annoys people. And I have a lot of people who don't give a flip about weight loss there, or don't give a flip about my podcast. So it just annoys them. So I'm focusing on just posting on the Fat Guy Podcast Facebook page more. So lastly, if you don't want to depend on social media to know when the new podcast is posted, obviously being a patron is the best way, because you get a notification every time. But you could just make sure that you subscribe to the podcast, whether that be on Apple Podcast or the Google Play Store or Spotify or iHeartRadio or TuneIn Radio. We're everywhere. You can find the podcast anywhere. Fat Guy Podcast. Wow, did we get all that stuff out of the way? I think we did. So let's get right into it. So first I'm going to talk about overall the benefits of intermittent fasting. Most of these will apply to extended fasting as well, so they kind of cross over. What I will say is that a couple of these, the benefit is greater when you fast longer. But contrary to what you might be thinking, some of these benefits are actually reduced when you fast longer. So there is a little bit of benefit going both ways. That's why I like to mix it up. I do intermittent fasting and I do extended fasting. So we'll talk about the benefits, and then after that, I'm going to talk about, why I specifically fast and how I believe it's changing my health and hopefully is going to help me overcome, quite honestly, what is an enormous number of health challenges that I have. Like, I already had health challenges, and then this year I've just been smacked in the face with health challenges. And I'll be honest, it's made things, I don't know what the word to use is, but I feel like things that have happened to me this year have definitely potentially shortened my lifespan, and I'm trying to desperately offset those. So let's jump right into it. Obviously, the number one benefit of fasting is weight loss. So this is why when like people misunderstand me when I'm always talking about how healthy and safe fasting is. When I say that, you got to put it in context. If you're a person who's malnourished, or you're a person that's underweight, you're a person with a super, super low percentage of body fat, fasting probably isn't going to be all that great for you. But I don't know many people like that. I may only know one or two people like that. Now, granted, I don't know millions of people, but most everybody I know is of average weight or overweight or obese or morbidly obese. But basically everybody I know falls into one of those categories. And so fasting is perfectly safe for them, especially intermittent fasting. So weight loss would be number one. I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but I do believe it's also the best way to lose weight because of some of these other things that come into play. Number two gets into some of the health aspects, which honestly, I can't tell you how many people I know that intermittent fast or time restrict eat, and we'll get into what the difference in that is momentarily, and they do it just for health. They don't even need to lose weight. But lowered blood pressure. There's been several studies come out. The Nutrition of Health and Aging in 2018 did a study on the 16-8 intermittent fasting. There was a study in the March 2019 issue of Nutrient Magazine. Also, just recently in October in the European Journal of Nutrition, another study that showed that intermittent fasting led to greater reductions in systolic blood pressure than just diet alone. And it did it without necessarily you having to eat healthier food, which is quite remarkable. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't opt for healthier food if you get the chance, but just shows how powerful fasting is. I know a couple of people personally who have asked me about intermittent fasting, and I have talked to over the past few years, and they had high blood pressure, and it came down within a matter of days. Like within a matter of days of implementing fasting and intermittent fasting, and they got off their blood pressure pills. And I can't tell you how many people know that lost weight and it happened. But I mean, it happens really quickly. And if you're a person that thinks that taking a bunch of pills is fine, it's not. I'm just going to be honest with you, and you can look at the research on this, but you can control symptoms, but you're not getting at the root cause. And when blood pressure pills are a great example of that. You have high blood pressure, and you take a pill that hacks it and lowers your blood pressure. It does not address the root cause of why you have the high blood pressure. All you're doing is just hacking the symptoms, so the symptom goes down, which gives you a false sense of security. I want to put this in because I didn't even mean to get into this, but I'm going to because I think it's important. I don't think people adequately understand how harmful medicine is to some degree by masking underlying disease and making people think they're okay. So let's just do let's just make something up that clarifies this better. Let's say that, what can I say? Let's say that you got your thigh slashed, and it slashed your femoral artery, and somebody rushes over, and they are able to cover the outside of your leg with a bandage, and it's covered in such a way that you can no longer see the bleeding, and the bleeding isn't gushing out. But there has been no repair made to the femoral artery that was slashed open. Now, first of all, you don't live long when you slash your femoral artery, period. So it's kind of a dramatic example. But let's just say you live a while. And let's say that there was no pain. Let's say it was, for some reason, there was no pain involved. You couldn't see the blood gushing. You have effectively stopped the symptoms of a slashed femoral artery, right? There's no more symptoms. You don't feel anything. You don't see any blood gushing. Oh, well, we fixed it. Well, you didn't fix it. You just masked the symptom. And this is what happens with things like blood pressure medicine. Blood pressure medicine is able to correct symptoms, but it doesn't correct what the problem is. And it's not 100% of people, but I was just reading a paper on this a couple of weeks ago. It's into the 90s. Like 95% of people with high blood pressure, it's all because of one reason, and that's elevated insulin. It's because you have insulin resistance, you have elevated insulin, and As soon as the insulin comes back down to normal levels and it's not chronically elevated, the blood pressure comes down. It's amazing how it happens. It's almost a direct 1-to-1 correlation. So if you're insulin resistant and you're one of those people that eats all day and all this kind of stuff, I'm sorry, somebody's just blowing my my text up right now. I apologize for that. Hopefully it isn't too annoying. But it's almost a direct 1-to-1 correlation. And once they space out their eating, or either they take the carbs out, they do something, some kind of intervention, so that their insulin isn't chronically elevated. When it falls, the blood pressure falls to normal. So I spent a lot of time on number 2, and this podcast is going to get long, so I apologize. Blood pressure, though, is number 2. Inflammation is a big one, and it's a big one for me, and I'll talk about that when I get into why I'm personally doing intermittent and extended fasting. But reduced inflammation is huge. There was a study in the Nutrition Research Journal that came out not too long ago that showed 50 participants who fasted for religious reasons, and they tested throughout this process their inflammatory markers. This includes high reactive C-reactive protein, and all that kind of stuff. It showed that the inflammation was reduced and continued throughout, which is huge. Look, inflammation is the primary cause of heart disease. It is the primary cause of so many diseases: stroke, heart disease, these type things. So inflammation is huge, and fasting it controls it. It doesn't just control it temporarily. If you will implement times of not eating, whether that be hours, you extend it out hours, or you go over a day, you control it pretty easily. Another big one, and I get people asking me all the time about keto and cholesterol, because I think the latest numbers I saw on this is about 85% of people who go keto, their cholesterol numbers actually get great and look great and make the doctor happy, but about 15% the cholesterol numbers go crazy. Now, that doesn't mean that my doctor's one of those. I can't convince my doctor that my cholesterol is fine. He's trying to get me to go on, and I have the best doctor ever too. I'm not bashing him. I have the amazing doctor, but he's trying to get me to go Mediterranean and telling me that for genetic, all this stuff. I'm not going to get into the flawed science behind cholesterol. I'll just say this. If keto is something that has concerned you and you can't get past it, and you like your doctor and your doctor can't get past it, and neither of you can get past it, intermittent fasting is a great way to bring your cholesterol under control and lose weight and get healthier. And so you don't have to worry about the keto aspect of it. Although, just for the record, keto is fine for every single person on the planet, with the exception of a few pregnant people, really young people who are in the aggressive growing phase and need to be anabolic, and people with the APOE4 LA. So there's too many studies to even talk about on this. You had this one just came out in the Journal of Obesity. There's a great study that the Centers for Disease Control published in Prevention Magazine. The Mayo Clinic had a great study that came out about 6 months ago. All of them conclusively, cholesterol numbers come into alignment relatively quickly for some people, over a long period of time for others, just by fasting, intermittent fasting, extended fasting. Stroke survivors. So if you had a stroke, right? And you, after you have the stroke, you start implementing intermittent fasting. There was just a study, this is about a year ago, the study came out in the Experimental and Translational Stroke Medicine Journal, found that intermittent fasting provided a protective mechanism for the brain. In cases where stroke occurs, intermittent fasting warded off continued brain injury. So, look, if it helps post-stroke, just by the way of mechanics, it would have to work towards stroke prevention as well. That just follows. And there may be studies on that, but I don't have time to look them up. Increased brain function and clarity. Now, I first noticed this on a ketogenic diet, because on a ketogenic diet, you're not eating the carbs and your body goes into ketosis, and most of your cells start running almost exclusively, many of them exclusively, off of ketone bodies. And when the brain, about 80% of the brain is functioning exclusively off ketone bodies, you achieve this level of clarity, and focus like you wouldn't believe. And this isn't just some anecdotal thing. Now they've actually shown this in several studies. One of them was a rat study where they had these mazes and complicated things the rats had to do. But there was also a human study that came out in the Johns Hopkins Health Review that confirmed this as well. So, look, if you want to think better, and I'm going to throw this anecdote in there. I remember how they always used to say, "Oh boy, do you want to pass that test today, or you want to get through this interview today? Make sure you start your day with a good breakfast." That is such wrong information. You want to stop eating at around 4 or 5 the day before, and you want to fast all the way through the night and through the next morning, so that by the time you get to that interview, you have elevated ketone bodies, and your cells are working off ketones, and you will have such better cognition and clarity. It's not even close. I don't want to get too deep into this because this is kind of touchy, and they're just now starting to do really, really good studies on this. But there was a review recently in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that showed a protective effect against cancer in people who used fasting as a part of their normal lifestyle. There's something called autophagy. This is involved with cell turnover and cell renewal. As many of you know, depending on which cells and which organs and stuff, but basically every few months, 3 months to 6 months or whatever, you have a completely different body. Like all the cells that was you 3 to 6 months ago, they're dead and gone. They don't exist anymore. You still look the same and you think you're the same, but you are a whole new person from head to toe. And so part of the way this works is something called autophagy, where these aging cells, these damaged cells, the body goes in and scavenges them and reclaims the protein and expels the waste, and you clear it out through a process called autophagy, which is just an amazing thing. A guy just won the Nobel Prize with his work with autophagy just a couple of years ago. And it's a fascinating thing, but what's most important for you to know is, and this again goes back to that cancer prevention effect, protective effect. A lot of people with these damaged cells, you don't stop eating long enough for autophagy to come in and clean them up. And so they just keep growing and growing and growing. Eventually they're too long. Autophagy can't deal with them, even if you did stop eating long enough for autophagy to get in there. And these become runaway cancer cells, amongst other things that happen that are bad. But there's so many studies on this, I can't even quote them all. But there was just one back in May in Nutrients magazine. You can read all the work about the Nobel Prize for autophagy. And autophagy is a fascinating subject. Anyway, I won't get into it, but increased cell turnover and all that comes with it is amazing. And the reclamation of old proteins, damaged proteins. All right, these last two are going to be the big two for me. I'll mention a couple of bonus ones, but I won't go into detail. But these past two are the big two. Reduced insulin resistance. So the reason most of us have fat bellies, 99.9% of us have fat bellies, is because we've eaten so much carbs, refined carbs, processed food, and sugars. There's two different thoughts now, and the one that seems to be winning is that you just max out on fat cells, and once fat cells are actually protective. That's why your body can even function at all with all the crap you're putting it in it, because you can. And once you get to where you can't store any more fat, you shut down. The type 2 diabetes kicks in, and eventually you die from it. But it's generally known as insulin resistance, and it is the reason most everybody is fat. And again, that's the reasons it comes. Now, when you start fasting and putting time between food and giving you two things happen. Your body gets a break from having to deal with carbohydrate and sugar, and two, you start burning and getting rid of some of the fat cells. It's a two-pronged effect that reduces insulin resistance, which obviously helps you immensely going forward with everything: your weight, type 2 diabetes, all inflammation, all the secondary causes of inflammation like heart disease and stroke, and it's a cascading effect. It deals with all of it. So the inflammation, or rather insulin resistance aspect of intermittent fasting and extended fasting is phenomenal. Now, I just did a whole podcast on this not long ago, so you can go back and look back on it. But there's this new study come out that showed that people who fasted, who had, they only looked at people who had a heart catheterization, whether this was just to go in and look because something was supposedly wrong, or they went in and did stents, or they did in and removed some sludge, or whatever, if there was heart catheterization involved. They looked at all these people, I believe it was for 7 years, and the people who fasted, implemented an intermittent and occasional extended fasting routine, lived longer than the people who didn't. It was with a significant level of accuracy. Statistically, it was significant. There was no question about it, and it's just huge. And so they went beyond that and looked at people developing cardiovascular disease, and bingo bango, people who implemented intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, and some extended fasting were much less likely to get cardiovascular disease. That's huge. That's the number one killer of humans. So anything you can do to stop that greatly helps you out in many ways. Now, the two bonus ones, and there's a lot of study on this, most of it in rodent models, but it shows that people who fast, well, it shows two things, and they've gone at it two different ways. But people who are on a long-term calorie-restricted diet, so they eat about 20 to 30% less calories than they should eat every day, live longer. But then, just as even more powerful is people who intermittent fast and people who put longer lengths of time between consuming meals have increased longevity. Not get into that. Valter Longo, it's pronounced Valter, but I think it's spelled Walter. I believe he's at USC, some place in Canada. He is the premier expert on fasting and longevity, and you can look up his work. It's amazing. And lastly, people who fast sleep better. I'm not going to get into that. It's just a bonus one that we'll look at. So, the second part of this podcast will be me, why I fast specifically. And I see that we're already at 22 minutes. Boy, it took much longer than I thought. The last part won't be that long, but why I fast specifically, the differences between intermittent fasting, extended fasting, and time-restricted eating, and what I do and how I do personally. First, I will pause for a break now. Now, if you're a patron, you're not going to hear a break here. If you're not a patron, you will. That's how it works. So let me quickly, before we take this break, let you know that if you hate commercials and they annoy you, go to losewithmason.com. Losewithmason.com. Chunk me a few bucks to support what we do, and you'll have access to the no commercial, no BS, shortened, concise, no garbage podcast that only my patrons get at losewithmason.com. Well, few things to get to. Differences between intermittent fasting, time-restricted eating, and extended fasting. I don't think they're that complicated. I think the one that has the biggest issue is people call time-restricted eating intermittent fasting when it's not. So it's generally accurate to say that you are not fasting until you hit right at the 24-hour mark. In other words, you have to basically go a complete day without food for it to be considered a fast. So people who are doing 16-8, 18-6, in other words, they're fasting 16 hours and eating in an 8-hour window, or people who are fasting 18 hours and eating in a 6-hour window, or people who are doing 20-4. These people are doing time-restricted eating. Now, it's a form of fasting in a way. You're stretching the period of time between when you put calories in your body. But it's not technically a fast until you get around the 24-hour mark. Now, they say that if you do a 23-1, which is what I do a lot of days, I'll go 23 hours without eating, and then I'll either eat one meal in that last hour, and it may only be 15 minutes. Like I may only eat, it take 15 minutes, and then I'll jump right back into not eating again. Or I may eat, and it take 15 minutes, and I'll be like, I'm just not sure if that was enough food today. I'll wait 15, 20 minutes, and I'll go, no, you know what? I'm going to eat another little something, and I'll go get something, usually higher protein type stuff, eat it, and then I'll close it out and be done. Either way, it's generally recognized that if you get to that point, around the 23-hour mark, you've basically made it a day, and you could technically call that fasting. I would say don't get, you don't need to get really all that hung up on the terminology. I don't think that's important. You just need to know that the longer you stretch time between calories, the more fasting you're doing. Okay? But that's the difference. So the difference between intermittent fasting and extended fasting, that's a little bit trickier. But I've read a few things, and it's pretty well accepted that intermittent fasting ends at somewhere between 36 to 48 hours. So that would be alternate day fasting would be considered intermittent fasting. People who pick a day out of the week a couple of times and fast. So this would be like people that don't eat on Tuesday and Thursday. So those days aren't together. They're not back to back, but it's two separate days. That's considered an intermittent fast. And if you go up to 48 hours straight, that's considered intermittent fast. It's generally accepted once you move past 48 hours, you're definitely into the extended fasting range. And extended fasting can go, from 72 hours to 7 days to 31 days. And there's a guy I follow on YouTube. The name of his YouTube channel, by the way, is The Fasting Fat Man. He is remarkable. He fasted for 150 days from last December to, I don't know, sometime around whatever, spring or summer. I don't know when it ended. It's 150 days. And then he took a few months off and basically did OMAD keto. And then he really wants to hit this goal by December, so he went back into a fast, and I think he's at around day 60 of his second fast. So he did a 150-day fast this year, and he's now into like a 60-day fast this year. He started out at well over 500 pounds. He's down to around 200 now. He's lost 300 pounds this year in less than a year. So I just throw that out there. Extended. I'm not recommending you doing that. I'm not recommending you do any of this. I'm not a doctor. You need to talk to a doctor, okay? Just telling you what I do. What do I do? Most days, I do somewhere around 20 hours to 23 hours of no calorie intake. So that would be known as 20 and 4 or 23 and 1. That's most days. Some days, I'm just hungrier earlier, and I know that I'm hungry earlier, and like it's not cravings or anything like that. It's like I just know I'm hungry. And so I'll eat earlier, and so it turns into a 16-8, And some days I do a 18-6, which is a little bit longer than 16-8. But basically every single day, I'm not eating any sooner than 16 hours. Generally, it's 20 hours, okay? And I can squeeze 2 meals into a 20 and 4. Sometimes I'll eat a meal and decide I don't want one later, and I had planned on it being a 24, and I'm like, you know what? I just don't need any more, and I'll just jump right back into not eating, so it'll wind up being a 20 and 1. Which really helps me extend into the next day. And then there's some days like I'm doing now, which I think I'm going to do this for a while. I'll go into a rotating thing of 48s or 72s or something. So I actually kicked off yesterday, 72s, and I hope to knock out at least 10 of these back to back. So I'll fast for 72 hours. I'll eat a really large meal or maybe a couple of meals within an hour or less time. And then I'll jump right back in and do another 72. Then I'll eat again within an hour, whether it be one meal or maybe 2 meals in that hour. Then I'll jump back into 72s. I want to do at least 10 of these back to back. We'll see how it goes. I feel like that's where I'm at right now. I feel like that's how I want to close the year out. So we'll see how that goes. Why do I fast? Well, weight loss. Obviously, weight loss is a thing with me. But as you may know, I have this damaged foot that just never healed, even though they said it healed. Complications from that led to me having a couple of deep vein thrombosis in my leg, plus a bunch of secondary clots. These broke off and went to my lungs. I have several pulmonary embolisms. One of them is a saddle embolism, which my ER doctor told me was the most occlusive he'd ever seen. And we talked about earlier about the benefits of fasting, and one of those was autophagy, where your body goes in and scavenges old damaged protein, recycles it, and cleans up the other stuff and spits it out as waste. And there's some evidence out there. It's hard for me to find much on it, but blood clots definitely fall into that category. So there's nothing you can do to get rid of blood clots but wait. Like, I take blood thinners, but all that does is keep you from getting new clots. Like, you don't want any new clotting stuff to stick to the old clotting stuff. You don't want clots to get bigger. You don't want any more breaks, because it breaks, it goes to my lungs, the next one kills me. And that could still happen, by the way. I think I'm a couple of months clear from that now, and I'm still not in the clear. I'm just not. I'm way more in the clear than I was. It's like the first 24 hours is the most. If you survive that, you're okay. If you survive the 7-day, you move to another category. You survive 30 days, you move to another category. But I think there's still like a 3 to 5% chance that I die from complications of these blood clots in the next 3 years. So it is what it is. So fasting to me, it's definitely weight loss, but I want autophagy to get in there, and I want these clots cleaned up. If my body, through the process of autophagy, can, reclaim these protein cells and clean them out and help me in some kind of way. So, and I don't feel like I've done enough of that. That was my plan when I came out of the hospital. I've done a ton of short-term fasting, the 24s and stuff, 20s and 23s, whatever. But I think I've only done one fast that was more than a couple of days. And so I need to get on top of that. And that's why I fast. Obviously, my concerns over cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's, and stroke, and all these other things that I didn't get into. Inflammation is huge. Obviously, insulin resistance. I got it. I haven't been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, but it hasn't been that long ago that I actually broke down and ate a burger with the bun and all that kind of stuff. And I tracked my blood sugar, and it went crazy. Basically like a person with type 2 diabetes would do. So obviously, for reducing the insulin resistance and preventing the continued escalation of type 2 diabetes, that's why I fast. There's a lot of reasons I fast. And I'm not sure what else I can say about it, but, talk to your doctor. I'm not a doctor. But see if it's part of a healthy lifestyle for you, and there's many ways you can. The 16-8 is super easy. 16 to 8, you stop eating at 6 or 7 or whatever that night before, whenever it is, and you don't eat till lunch the next day. That's what 16-8 is. It's super easy. And when I say don't eat, that means you don't drink Cokes, you don't drink Sprites, you don't drink Pepsis, you don't drink Gatorade. You just drink water. You can have sparkling water, you can have carbonated water, you could have black coffee, you can have unsweetened tea, but there's no calorie consumption, none, for those 16 hours. And then you'd eat from like noon to 8. And that's essentially how easy a 16-8 is, and anybody can do that. It's highly beneficial, and so many people lose weight by doing nothing but making that change. They don't change what they eat. They still eat the same foods they always ate. They make that one change, and the weight comes off. It's remarkable. Thanks for listening today. If you haven't considered being a patron supporter, just a way of saying, hey, thanks for what you do, and I'll gladly take your commercial-free, ad-free, BS-free podcast that I get 3 days ahead of everybody else. Head on over to losewithmason.com to take advantage of that. Follow us on social media. Fat Guy Podcast is their username. Subscribe to us there, and if you think this might help somebody, share it with them. Appreciate you so much. We'll talk to you next time.